my lane fast, call it high speed. I've been working hard, yeah, I've been working nightly. If you think you'll win, ha, nah, unlikely. I be taking shots, yeah, cold-blooded, icy. Watching numbers grow is what I call sightseeing. In the front row, run it up when they hype me. The following grows, they know how to ignite me. Call me CEO, I've been running right, see. And I ain't playing games, I create my own lane, making pleasure out of pain, turning losses into gains, I'm the boss, I'm making change. I've been rocking this exchange, popping off and risking things, gonna make a fucking name. I just wanna be famous, but I don't want that cheap fame. No, I'm not that vain, I just wanna be greatness. 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 Ain't no motherfucker in this world could do it like me. Open up your eyes and insert a little rising. You don't have to love me, you don't have to like me. Got enough love in myself, in my psyche. You should have the same in your brain nightly. If you wanna taste it, you can fucking try me. If you wanna hate, you know where to find me. And if you go and hate this, you can fucking fight me. Okay, I'm going off every chance I get. I don't really take a loss, well, I'll admit. That's why I'll make it to the top, yeah, I commit. And no, I'm never getting lost, I get after it. Investing in my own stock, cause it's faster than any crypto hits go, let me spend. Everything that you see is something I invent, and it's only a percent. I'm gonna take shots, if I miss all, forget it. I'll take a fat loss just to learn all that's in it. I'm taking snapshots, learning how to fall and get it. I'm getting back up, always stand tall, don't sweat it. I never back up, I don't miss a thing or regret it. I'm always learning, you could call me academic. I'm always working, never been apathetic. That energy is like a poison, needs some antiseptic. Ain't no motherfucker in this world could do it like me. Open up your eyes and insert a little rising. You don't have to love me, you don't have to like me. Got enough love in myself, in my psyche. You should have the same in your brain nightly. If you wanna taste this, you can try me. If you wanna hate this, you know where to find me. And if you go and hate this, you can fight me. Ain't no motherfucker in this world could do it like me. Open up your eyes and insert a little rising. You don't have to love me, you don't have to like me. Got enough love in myself, in my psyche. You should have the same in your brain nightly. If you wanna taste it, you can fucking try me. If you wanna hate, you know where to find me. And if you go and hate this, you can fucking fight me. No motherfucker in this world can do it like me. Open up your eyes and insert a little rising. You don't have to love me, you don't have to like me. Got enough love in myself.
Hey everybody, how are we all? Welcome to Aussie True Crime. If you're new here, I like to cover mainly Australian true crime cases and paranormal cases that I go on with Spirit Time. So I hope you'll stick around and listen to a few of my stories and maybe like and subscribe to my channel. If anyone wants to join the membership, I have posted it at the top of the comments, because at the end of tonight, we're going to be doing one of our first membership giveaways. Well, not our first, but yeah. So if you stick around to the end and you remember, you might be lucky and get something. So who have we got in here? Spirit Time, of course. How are you? 71, how are you? Crystal. So good to see you all here. Well, today we're covering a case, and this case is another Australian one. It's about Luke Batty. So I'm going to get straight into it. It's not a very long one, but I still think this story needs to be told. This one was done back in 2014. Luke Batty was 11 years old in 2014, and he was from Victoria, Australia. That's where I'm from. So Luke loves sports, particularly football. This is him at the front of the video with his mum. His mum described him as an affectionate, funny person. He wasn't the best scholar, but he was intelligent and he really enjoyed school. His mother, Rosie Batty, and father, Greg Anderson, were not together at the time and had not been for quite a long time either. So Rose Batty, who's on the front of my video with him, and Greg Anderson met back in 1992, where they worked together as an recruitment company, and their relationship lasted for about 2 years. In this time, Greg did show some signs of violence, but not towards Rosie. So after 2 years, the pair went on and they broke up, they went their separate ways, um, and just moved on with their lives, entered into new relationships, and didn't really think about each other for a little while, at least. So I'm going to start my video so you can see these people who I'm talking about. And I am putting a trigger warning out. This story could trigger people, so please just keep that in mind. So this is beautiful Luke, and this is his mother, Rosie. So 8 years later, after they'd gone their separate ways, Rosie Batty and Greg Anderson resumed contact. For what I could find, it was Greg who made the first initial contact, but I couldn't find any reliable source that could confirm it either. The relationship, hi Tammy, the relationship they resumed was, for what I understand, a purely physical one, and it also resulted in Rosie falling pregnant for the first time. This was her first baby. So Rosie was in her late 30s, and at the time, this was a high risk pregnancy, and she did admit that the pregnancy was accidental. She didn't picture herself being with Greg Anderson in a long-term relationship, and in fact, she hadn't even really pictured herself being a mother. So Rosie herself grew up in the UK. That's where she lost her mother at a very young age, and this loss very early in life led Rosie to develop a fear of losing people that she loved. Regardless, Rosie decided to go through with the pregnancy. So Rosie and Greg's son, Luke Batty, here he is, was born on June the 20th, 2002, and Greg Anderson was not present at his son's birth. Instead, he was at a Russian Orthodox monastery in New South Wales. I couldn't find any explanation as to why he was there instead of being at his son's birth, but from what I could find, it did appear that Rosie had some friends with her at her son's birth, so at least she wasn't alone. But it was really sad that Greg wasn't at this time. That should have been joyous for the both of them. Hey, my beautiful van. So, Greg eventually did return and take part in his newborn son's life, and at first he was actually a very involved father, despite not being present for the birth. He was there a lot. So not long after Luke's birth, Greg assaulted Rosie again, for the first time, forcing Rosie to get into, they got into a physical altercation, and she described it as having to wrestle him. And at this time, she still had her Caesar stitches, in which I can imagine getting in a physical alteration when just after you've had surgery and you've still got the stitches in, let alone, I mean, in her stomach. I can't imagine how painful that would have been for her. But not surprisingly, this incident did bring an end to their relationship. So the pair did not remain in contact. Oh, they didn't stay together, but they remained in contact for the sake of Luke. But unfortunately, Luke wasn't a witness to any of these alterations between his parents from a very young age. So around the time Luke was 2 years old, he had witnessed his father assault his mother again. Greg told Rosie as he left her home that day that if you ever stop me from seeing my son, I'm going to hurt you and your animals. So the next day, Rosie went and obtained an intervention order, naming herself as the protected person on the intervention order. It's basically a restraining order against somebody, but this intervention order meant that Greg could only approach Rosie and not go to her home unless Rosie gave permission for him to do so. So Rosie would later describe obtaining this intervention order as a huge, huge fearful step, as Rosie really did not know how Greg would react to the news, as taking out the intervention order was the first step Rosie had really put in place, or the first roadblock that she'd ever put in place to protect herself and her son. So I can only imagine it would have been a shock to the system for Greg when he got the intervention order as well. So Greg Anderson, however, had never been violent at all towards his son Luke. In fact, he had a really great relationship with his son. They loved each other, and that was evident, and Luke loved his father a lot. Greg seemed really keen to be part of Luke's life. Therefore, Rosie did still allow Greg to have contact with Luke, despite his abuse towards Rosie. But she did do her best to encourage their father and son relationship to really blossom and flourish. Rosie did try to instill into Luke, however, that although Luke loved his father and his father loved him, Luke may not always like the things that his father did. So throughout Luke's younger years, Greg had the tendency to disappear for periods of time, going back to the Russian Orthodox Church in which he stayed at when Luke was born. Those who spent time at the monastery with Greg noticed increase of that he became stranger and his behavior became stranger. They started to worry about the way that Greg would act when he was there. At times, Greg would state that he was seeing something that no one else was seeing, so he was basically imagining things being there. And during one of these times away, Greg sent Luke an email, and at this time, Luke was only 3 years old, so it wasn't like he was going to receive and read this email. Um, so he knew it was going to go straight to Luke's mum, Rosie. The email stated, I'm disappointed in you, Luke, and you have become too feminine. Your spirit, Luke, has a dark hood on your head, and evil has its glued in your mum's life. I don't know what the email means. I don't think Rosie understood what the email meant, but it gave a little bit of insight into what was going on in Greg's head at that moment. So they eventually, caused through a time period in Luke and Rosie's life where it seemed that Greg Anderson had finally begun to accept that he would not be part of Rosie's life and that he would play a role in Luke's, but not be with Rosie. So that was something that he was trying to deal with, and do you know what I mean? He finally got it. We know sometimes males can take a little bit longer. But during this period, the intervention order actually expired, and Rosie didn't bother to renew it. And just to clarify, she didn't bother to renew it because Greg had not been causing any trouble lately, so she didn't see the need to. So also during this time, Rosie actually entered into another romantic relationship with someone else. I couldn't find out exactly how long this other relationship had lasted. I think it must have lasted a few years because by the time they broke up, Luke was 9 years old. But you can kind of see the life that they were living. So here's Rosie and Luke. So in this time, Luke had really grown up into a beautiful, quirky young boy. and Rosie described as being a very easy child. Rosie was just really happy with how things were going in her life, in her son's life, especially with the fact that it appeared that Greg was getting on with his own life now. However, when Rosie did become single again, Luke, as I said, Luke was 9 years old. She did struggle quite a bit with juggling all of the responsibilities she had, like her life, um, things with Luke, her animals, her work, just working things out. She had helped initially from her like she had help from her partner that before they separated, and now it was gone. And at this point, Greg stepped in back in to help Rosie sort out her life. But it'd really been a few years since Rosie and Greg had been around each other. So Rosie really began to forget the incidents of the past, or at least put them to the back of her mind. And because, as I said, she was feeling incredibly overwhelmed at this point in her life, she just let it happen. So her relationship just ended and she really needed help. It was a kind of an ironic thing that Greg was trying to help Rosie sort out her life when his life at this point was honestly in shambles. He had no home at the time and he was basically homeless. He had no job. Rosie was later described him as being basically unemployed, and Greg was living out of his car. The final straw came for Greg when his car, which was his home and his transport, broke down. So initially, Rosie did offer to help Greg with a place to stay while he was getting back on his feet and got his car fixed, but his response was not good. The old Greg came back, and to say he came back, he really lost his temper, which caused Rosie immediately to retract her offer for a place to stay. This made Greg really enraged that Rosie had taken back her offer. And Rosie and Luke's house that night, he came there. He ended up chasing Rosie around her house. Luckily, she did manage to grab the phone and call the police. But before she could get there, Greg caught up with her and caught up with Rosie and dragged her behind the couch and had assaulted her. Unfortunately, Luke was witness to this whole event unfolding, and the police did eventually show up and Greg was arrested and charged on the police statement regarding the incident. It had stated that Greg had suffered from a mental paranoia disorder at the time. Um, this also applied for, like Rosie applied for a new intervention order, or the police did. I'm not sure who did, but there was a new one put out. And this time, both Rosie and Luke were actually were named in the protection order. I don't know if Rosie applied for it or if the police applied on her behalf. It would make sense that the police did it because he was a former partner. I just don't know. I couldn't find who actually put that in place. But logically, it was the next step to happen. So Rosie had really hoped at this point that Greg would go out and seek treatment, that he would receive the treatment that he desperately needed. However, Greg did not speak out nor receive any treatment for his mental health or his anger issues. Greg did actually tell people at the monastery that he was at and that he attended that he was diagnosed and medicated for schizophrenia, but Rosie was not aware of any such diagnosis, and nor is there any record anywhere to really back this up either. So I couldn't find anything other than Greg saying it. At this time as well, Greg was also frequently attending a Hare Krishna temple, but was eventually banned from the temple for attacking an 80-year-old man. It was a fairly minor incident, but I believe the 80-year-old man had complained to Greg over just the litter that had come into the property or near the temple, and Greg had physically assaulted him. So the anger issues were still there. And this was just another incident that was stacking up against Greg to demonstrate the level of anger and violence that he was getting to, I guess. But Greg was still allowed to have contact with Luke. More trying, like he was trying more times. He was still calling him because he really had never shown signs of anger or violence towards Luke. It was only other people. So Rosie was still letting him and still trying to support this relationship, what is something I take my hat off to for anyone that has been in a broken relationship, to still let the other partner be part. It's really, really hard. But she was really trying to help the two of them stay together. So jumping forward to 2013, and Greg Anderson was at it again with Rosie. He was standing at the front gate shouting that he was going to harm her. In other words, but that's, YouTube won't let me say it. Rosie had no idea what had brought this on, or this outburst from Greg, but Rosie did ring the police, as it was completely inappropriate. But also it was a breach of the intervention order that was in place, because at this time he still had it in place. The police told Rosie that they would come and arrest Greg the next day when he came to pick up Luke. I think they were choosing to arrest him the next day because they didn't actually know where Greg lived, and he was technically homeless still for a good chunk of this time, which I believe included the period where they wanted to arrest him. But what I don't understand is how Greg had permission basically to be collecting his son the next day. I thought that Luke was under the protection order and he was named on the intervention order. I'm not sure if it's a bit of misunderstanding of the information in this case, or if it was just Rosie giving permission for Greg to still be part of Luke's life, and she was just letting him go. So I'm guessing that was more of the case. Rosie had allowed it, and Greg was still having the frequent contact with Luke. But then why put his name on the intervention order in the first place? So that's where I come back to, maybe it was the police that had done it, not actually Rosie. So the next day, Greg came to see Luke. He was arrested in Rosie's driveway, and he was charged by the police. But he just walked free, and even after this incident, Greg was still allowed to contact, by law, to have contact with Luke again. So in the same year, 2013, one day when Luke and his father, Greg, were about to, they went off in the car and they were alone together in Greg's car, Greg turns to Luke and threatens him with a knife, and basically didn't say that he touched Luke with the knife, but he simply said it could all end with this. He proceeded to tell Luke how sick he was of his life, and how he wished that he could go on the next day. And he gave the impression that he wanted to do this with Luke. So he didn't want to be here. Obviously, Luke didn't know how to take this, and the fact that he had a knife this time. So, of course, Luke told his mother what had taken place, and Rosie, who had always felt that Luke was safe with Greg, had always defended his right to see his son. She felt utterly sick and disturbed at what had taken place, and felt that she could never trust Greg again with her son alone. And of course, Rosie at this point, unsurprisingly, decided that Greg would have no more contact with her son, and this was taken to court, and the court decided the same thing, that Greg would have like if he had further contact, it had to be in public areas. He wasn't allowed to be with Luke alone. So what also was revealed in the court at this time, however, was that Greg Anderson had child pornography charges in his name. So Rosie had no idea this was the first time that she was finding out, and she was overcome with fear that Greg had potentially could have been grooming Luke during their time together. It didn't appear that he had been, but of course, when you get told that, your imagination can only go where it can. And just having no idea what, or if she believed her son was safe with his father anymore. And as I've said, it was something that she'd really worked on. And it was due to some privacy laws as well that Rosie Batty was never informed of these other crimes that Greg had been charged with. So, like the police knew, So it's like the police knew that Luke was with his father often, but basically the police couldn't tell Rosie about the child pornography charges because of privacy laws, which I do understand, but also when the police know that a child under age is in that care of that person, do you mean there should be something there where they can share it, or a loophole or something? Because it's just really hard to understand that the police still let Luke have a relationship with his father. So in July 2013, Greg Anderson challenged the intervention order that had been put in place for him, not to be able to see his son, and as a result, he was given, again, access, but it was in public areas, as I said. So, for example, Luke was playing sports, and Rosie did agree to believing it was good enough for a decent, like, time for him to see him. But not long after this, the Victorian Child Protection Systems closed all of the cases on Luke and his father. So I don't know if the intervention order was still, like, where that lay then at that time. But by December of 2013, it appeared that Rosie and Luke's life was slowly returning to normal, and things were getting back on track, kind of thing. So Luke was doing well in school, and the two of them, Luke and Rosie, were about to head off to the UK to visit Rosie's family. They were going there over Christmas, which for most of us Australians, it would have been a nice thing because they probably would have seen a white Christmas. We don't get many of them here in Australia. So Luke would have been excited, and of course Rosie was too. So they're going on their holiday, going to have a white snowy Christmas. It just would have been a really good time for the both of them. During their time in the UK, though, Greg Anderson failed to make both his court appearances and his bail appearance, and warrants were issued out for his arrest again. So again, Rosie had no idea what was going on with Greg and was not informed that he had not turned up to his bail and court appearances. Also, during this time, Greg had another intervention order placed against him. This time it was by a roommate who Greg had not only threatened to hurt, but he had threatened to cut the roommate's head off. And not surprisingly, this roommate put an intervention order against Greg. So Rosie Batty was told none of this, as Greg became more aggressive and more violent and escalated, and not to mention the fact that he now had multiple warrants out for his arrest. The police didn't feel necessary to tell Rosie what was going on. And for someone that had access to her son like that, it just blows my mind again that, do you know what I mean? They couldn't at least tell her because she had no warning of how bad he'd gotten, and she had no warning of where this was going to end up. So on February the 5th, 2014, and at this point, both Rosie and Luke had returned from the UK. A police officer rang Rosie asking if she knew where Greg Anderson was staying at the time, like what his current address was, and Rosie did not know. But very coincidentally, Greg had actually called Rosie the same day to let her know of his new address. Um, as he just moved in somewhere else, I assume he probably just moved out of the roommate's house because, do you know what I mean, of what he'd done to him. So he'd finally found somewhere else. But anyway, Rosie did call the police and called them back and let them know where Greg was staying. Again, during this police intervention, Rosie was not informed of anything that was going on with Greg. And maybe if she had been informed, she would have made some very different decisions regarding what was going to happen next. So on February the 12th, 2014, which was a Wednesday evening, and not very long at all after Rosie had been contacted by the police as to Greg's whereabouts, Greg actually showed up at cricket practice that Rosie and Luke were at. So the cricket practice was at an oval. It was a public place, so technically Greg could be there because it was a public area. He was allowed to speak to his son in public areas. There was other people there. So Rosie thought it was all fine. Greg didn't seem to be in good spirits that day, and not to mention the fact that Luke had not seen his father since before going to the UK, so it'd been quite some time since they'd seen Greg. And Greg and Luke went together to practice playing some cricket in one of the cricket nets, initially playing with one of Luke's friends, then just practicing by themselves later. So this was after the game. Things were getting later in the evening, and things were beginning to wind down. And Luke asked his mother just if he could have a few more minutes playing with his father, as he hadn't seen him in quite a while. And his mother agreed, not seeing any harm. Do you know what I mean? They were in the public place, they were around everyone. And it was just a couple more minutes, even though the evening was starting to wind down. But at this point, most of the other kids and their parents had left the oval, but there was still a few people still scattered around. Shortly after Rosie had agreed to this, she heard a disturbing sound, and she put it down to it appeared as though Luke had had some kind of accident. At least that's what it looked like when she saw Greg leaning over Luke. But it turned out that the 8-year-old that was there with Luke and his father had actually witnessed the whole incident, and the young boy had ran back to his father, who was one of the cricket coaches, and was shouting at him with such intensity and hystericals that his father could not make out what he was trying to say. And all he could gather was that his son was saying something about a cricket bat and a boy in a yellow shirt. So Rosie immediately went to call the ambulance, although thinking it could not have been that bad, or she might have been overreacting. She did do it anyway, but she was incredibly stressed out at the situation. So she was also yelling to other people to do it. Rosie instead ran towards a group of people still on the oval, shouting for them to call the ambulance. This is really bad. As Rosie got closer to Greg and Luke, it appeared that there had been an accident and that Greg had accidentally injured Luke while they were practicing, possibly a knock in the head with the cricket bat. And this made sense at the time, but Greg's reaction was completely out of, like, it was just strange, over what had happened to his son. So Greg was comforting his son inside the cricket net as they waited for the ambulance. And at this point, there was no one else inside the cricket net because the young boy had gone back to his dad. So when the cricket coach actually went over to the cricket net to check on Luke and Greg and asked how Luke was, Greg responded by saying, "Yes, he's fine. He's in heaven now." So I've got these are actual photos of, like, the cricket field at the time. There's another one. And that's his mum again. So by this point, Rosie, who believed the accident must have been really serious, was screaming and inconsolable. Paramedics were coming. Eventually, they arrived to treat Luke's injuries, but they were unable to revive him, and he did pass away in the cricket net that evening by Greg's side. Before the paramedics could save Luke or do anything, it was too late. So that evening, however, they were forced to call the police when Greg Anderson had threatened the paramedics with a knife. And this was witnessed by more young children who would go on to tell the police what they'd seen that evening. Greg was seen hitting his son, Luke, over the head with the cricket bat repeatedly before getting a knife out and stabbing his son till his son passed. So Greg Anderson then proceeded to stab himself. When police arrived at the scene, he resisted arrest, and this forced the police to shoot him, and Greg passed away at 1:30 a.m. the next morning. So during the commotion, Rosie Batty had been reportedly asking her son Luke, but she was refused. She was told by the police that she wouldn't want to see, like, how Luke was at that time. And this time Rosie Batty didn't know what was going on because she was still thinking it was just an accident. She didn't actually realize that he had passed. And at this time, Greg Anderson's death, when he died, he had 4 warrants out for his arrest, but due to his homelessness, he was very difficult to track down. Greg had not been living in a boarding house at the time that he passed, and Greg also still had the 2 intervention orders against him at the time. So the next morning, Rosie Batty went into the police station to give a 3-hour-long statement to police, and this was after losing her son, her ex-partner. She might have been coming to terms with everything. She definitely was coming to terms with what had happened, but coming to terms with the truth about why it happened and how bad Greg had actually got. Rosie also made a statement to the media outside her home the next day. She stated, this is a quote from her: "I want to tell everyone your family violence happens to everyone, no matter how nice your house is, how intellectual you are. It happens to everyone, and that this has been an 11-year battle, but do the best you can, and you're a victim and you're homeless, and an intervention order doesn't stop anything like this happening." And she had tried everything to stop what was going on. They did have a candlelight vigil, which was attended by hundreds at the cricket oval, like his friends from school, people that he'd done sports with. Um, So Luke Batty had passed away. Rosie Batty puts she basically took it as a way of bringing mental health and domestic violence to the front for many people, um, because this was the main reason why he did what he did and why she had lost her son. So she did become a voice for Australia at the time. Um, Greg did not receive any treatment for any of his health issues or his anger issues at any point in his life, to the best of anyone's knowledge. Rosie stated that Luke was the only bright light in his life, and Rosie really had believed at the time that Luke was safe with his father in open public environments like the Oval, surrounded by other families. Rosie was unaware of the trouble that Greg had been in for months leading up to what had happened. She had been informed Rosie properly. Like, if she'd been informed properly about how bad things were getting and all of the other, do you mean, intervention orders and everything that was going on, maybe she would have made a different decision that day than letting Greg and Luke go and play. But do you know what I mean? And this is where we've just got to question. And I do understand that, do you mean, it's privacy, but when it's your underage children, there's got to be something there where police can share more information with you. So Greg, however, he did wait until most of the families had left the cricket oval that evening and took his chance to isolate Luke into the cricket net. This really does not, do you mean, it wasn't like an accident? It was, he premeditated what was going to happen, and basically to take the coward way after it. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been going at the police with the knife as well. So the police, child protection, and of course Rosie herself never believed that Greg, despite his history, would lay a finger on Luke. It was his own son. He'd spent years physically and mentally abusing Rosie, but he had never touched Luke except for that one incident in the car until this day. So Rosie stated that no one loved Luke more than Greg, his father. No one loved Luke more than she did. And Rosie believed that Luke's passing was the final and ultimate act of revenge that Greg could do on Rosie. Rosie also went on to start a foundation, and she started it in a tribute to her son, and so that's her son's, like, so that it wouldn't be in vain. She wanted to make sure that people learnt about mental health. She wanted to make sure that people learnt about domestic violence, and that's a lot of what the foundation does. It's still open, and I have put a link in my description to the foundation if anyone wants to go and have a look. But as I said, she basically didn't want her son's passing to be in vain, and she wanted people, as hard as it was because of everything she was going through, she wanted there to be something out there that, do you know what I mean, just to remember Luke and for people to learn. It became Rosie's new purpose in life, and it really brought family violence to the forefront of a lot of people's minds in Australia and across the world, where people had heard his story and people were touched by it. So in 2015, Rosie Batty was named Australian of the Year, and the following year, she was named number 33 in the list of the world's greatest leaders of Fortune magazine. In 2015 and 2016, Rosie Batty was also named the most influential in the influential people at the Impact 25 awards. So I've got to. So she did pick her life up. This is her with her award. They're called the 25 awards. So that's what she was in. Rosie stated that Luke was her little man and he did not die in vain, and will not be forgotten. You are beside me on this journey and with me every step of the way. So on June 3rd, 2018, the Luke Batty Foundation was announced on a website, and the same months, Rosie announced that she'd be stepping back from the foundation. I think they closed the doors on it, but you can still see the information. So I don't know if it's the foundation's actually still open, but as I said, it did bring a lot of talk that needed to be, and they did support a lot of families while it was open for victims of the family violence. But on the link that I have in the description, you could go and read it all, and I mean, it's all there. So I have made a little tribute video for Luke. Just let me remove this one. And after I play this, we'll get on with the membership draw and something special that I've got to tell you all. But let's just watch this for a minute, just in memory of Luke and Rosie and everything that they had gone through. So at the end of that too, I forgot to mention there was a book that she wrote. So do you know what I mean that's another thing that tells the story as well? Now I see Spirit Time had given away some memberships. So I am doing a membership draw and I'm going to do this every month. I'm just filling in the people that got memberships today and then we're going to draw it. Just give me 2 seconds. I just fill in the extras. Okay. So I'm gonna add this to the stream. So this is I want to thank everyone who has become a member. I know I haven't got a lot, but I want to give back to those. So what I'm giving away, I'm going to turn my camera on. I have started sublimating, and if you can see, this is not one that I sublimated, but I have been doing it. But it is one for my channel. So if you win, this is what you're going to get, and maybe a few extras. Um, Whoever does win, please just email me or contact me if you on other ways of contacting me. But you can always get me on my email. But good luck to everybody, and let's. So more truth for the missing has won the first one. I am doing a second. It will be a tumbler and some extras as well. So more truth for the missing. If I don't think you're in here today, but I'll get in contact with you. And we'll go one more time. And Daphne. So if they're not here and you know them, please make sure that they get in touch with me. As I said, either if you've got me on Facebook or Discord, or even my email, what I have dropped as well. Okay, I'm just going to remove this. Now, this weekend or next weekend, I won't be doing a live. I know I promised you every week, but Spirit Time and I are going on a paranormal ghost hunting thing, and we are going to be away for the whole weekend. So I wanted to give you a little sneak peek. Um, as I said, I won't be coming live, but we will be doing it, and the next weekend we're going to bring it and present it to you. And yeah, so where we're going is Ararat, and it's the Arradale Mental Asylum. So I've just done a little bit of here. It is one of the most haunted places in Australia. We've been to, and if anyone that knows me knows I speak so much of Beechworth. This is the sister asylum to Beechworth. So we are quite excited. It was, as I said, opened in the 1980s. 13,000 deaths in this building, and that's just the ones that were recorded. I will go into more of the history when we do the presentation on it. But yeah, we are quite excited. So I won't be here next weekend, but the weekend after, well, unless we decide to go live from there, but the weekend after definitely we'll be bringing everything that we do and everything that we capture. Spirit Time will be joining me for that one, and yeah. But I hope you have enjoyed today's show, and please don't forget to hit the like. Replay crew, I know you have been great watching my videos after, so remember to put something in the comments so that I know you all have watched. And yeah, I hope you have enjoyed it. I'll see you all next time.